Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. With me is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Hey, how we doing, my man?
Pretty good, pretty good. All right. So we finished our examination, I guess, of the text of the creation story, the first story of the Bible. I kind of want to say
Uh-huh.
Genesis 1, but I realize like it trickles into those few first verses of chapter 2. But
Genesis 1 plus.
yeah, I'm probably just going to refer to it as Genesis 1, even though we're
Yeah.
including those elements. But so there's just two summary episodes I think we want to do here real quick on the ideas that were presented in there, because we touched on most of the major ideas as we went through verse by verse, but there's a couple of small things. So we've mentioned throughout our lengthy journey of the verses the idea of the surrounding mythologies, and shown how the narrative of Genesis 1 is frequently very contradictory in a
Mhm.
rather direct way to the ancient narratives. But I think so far we've yet to address the deepest way in which it contradicts those surrounding Mesopotamian mythologies.
Mhm.
And that's because in the ancient Mesopotamian mythologies, the relationship between humanity and the gods is at its core an adversarial one. So humanity exists in these mythologies, at least from the gods' perspectives, to serve the gods directly. In some cases, man's even created specifically to carry on the burdens that have been assigned to lower gods.
Mhm.
Basically, there's some higher gods, and they created the lower gods in order to uh, serve them, basically. And then the lower
Mhm.
gods complain about having to do that. And so then the higher gods create man to serve the lower gods in place of the higher gods. And now they're serving all of the gods. But at its root, humanity is sort of a class of slaves.
Mhm.
And so this adversarial relationship exists in both the cultures that surrounded the birth of Judaism and the cultures that surrounded the birth of Christianity as well, right? Because while not necessarily direct slaves, if we look at the Romans understood humanity. If you look at their myths, humanity is often kind of this plaything of the gods.
Mhm.
They're almost akin to pieces on an elaborate chessboard in a way.
Mhm.
And humans have some level of free will, but the gods regularly create obstacles for them or intervene in their lives. And it often seems that those interventions are not to teach humanity anything specifically, but rather to make some sort of political point among the defined pantheon of gods
Mhm.
in their mythology. So it's interesting that we see in both cultures surrounding the birth of Judaism and then later Christianity this adversarial relationship between the
Mhm.
human and the divine, if you will. But in the Bible here, specifically in Genesis 1, we see what it appears to be a subtle difference, and I'll admit that. But I think it's actually an immensely different dynamic, especially when we consider the implications of this difference between the two. Because in the Bible, we see humanity is created to be in service of the divine, not slave of the divine, not in that same lack of sort of a free will kind of way that we see in the surrounding mythologies, but we see it more as a part incorporated into the divine plans, right? So you're not serving the divine directly, but you're a part of the plans that the
Mhm.
divine has set forth, right? So in some of the other ancient mythologies, they are interjected into what has been created. Whereas in the Bible, we see creation sort of culminating in this idea. So the Bible is actually describing something more akin to the regents of a king right? Where their duty is to represent the king in an official capacity. That's more what you see in the way humanity is conceived of here in Genesis 1. This is the idea of being made in the image of God, being God's imagers within society. Man's meant to bring, in a sense, God to the rest of creation, right? But in surrounding mythologies, man is meant to bring nature to the gods. So there's a directional difference there. I will admit that this does seem like a difference without much of a distinction, right? Because the regent of a king still is limited, right, to doing what the king would want them to do, in the way that kind of a slave is limited to doing what their master would want them to do. So that does, in a way, especially I think actually in our Western world, where we have more ideas of individualism and freedom, more incorporated in our societies, that may look to us like, well, isn't that kind of the same thing, right? But it's not really, because if you're made to serve the divine, and that is different though than you are meant to, if you're meant to serve the divine in a way where you are now performing the task of the divine benefiting the larger picture, that to me is different than, hey, go get stuff from nature, right, and bring it to me. That's clearly a different thing, not go act as me.
There is
the regent idea.
So I think you've heard the critique before that, like, God didn't make God, or God didn't make man in God's image. Man made gods in their image.
Yes.
And that critique seems more apt for the surrounding mythologies of the Near East than it does for, and especially later cultures like the Greeks and Romans, than it does for the God of the Bible here. Because in many ways, I think goodwill is one of the distinguishing features, is that it seems that the divine in this context has goodwill intended for his creation and for all that's involved in it, whereas that's not obvious from everything else, from other mythologies.
Yeah,
it's more obvious that they are, again, in man's image, the way humanity actually tends to be. Humanity does tend to be selfish. It does tend to be self-seeking on the whole, which may be a more controversial statement than I thought when I said it. But it does. People do tend to think of themselves, and they do tend to look out for what their interests are, which it makes sense that humanity would then look at the gods and then put them that way. And right. And if you are a human, this is what I think is really interesting. If you are in that context, in the past, it's very easy to look at the world and assume that everything is looking out for itself. It's a far easier assumption to just say, well, that must mean that divines are that way as well. One last thing then is number one, this is a revolutionary idea to say that God looks around at the world and created it good and intends it for good, and intends you for good. As what is interesting then is that as we enter a time in Western society where we're leaving behind a lot of these foundational.
Let me pause you right there.
You want to pause?
Let me pause right, because we're going to get to Western society. So let's mark that one down, because we're going to get there. I want to let me finish up the ancient perspective, and we're going to tail that into modern society. And I want to, because I do want to hear that.
Let's do that.
But I want to, let's finish with the ancients first, and then we'll deal with modern society. So I want to point out real quick what I think is probably the most important implication regarding this adversarial relationship and how that differs with what is in fact a cooperative relationship, right? And that is really, I think, what I was getting to in terms of the difference of working as a regent versus a slave, in that sense.
Cooperative. That's it.
Yeah. If we look at an adversarial relationship with the divine, right? If we take on that view like the ancients, then we must view our surrounding nature as existing at best to serve the ends of something other than us. And we must see it as something that is maybe a neutral obstacle in our way, right? Maybe it's at best this neutral obstacle. At worst, nature itself might even be understood as being adversarial, since it was created by those things which are adversarial to us, and maybe it is a means of keeping us in that slavery, right? That would be the way you would look at it if you were ancient man and saw this adversarial relationship. But and as I mentioned before, at the very least too, we also must recognize man, if it's this adversarial relationship, as being somehow distinct from nature rather than as a part of it. Now, this perspective, that the implication of that is that the progress of mankind is a credit only to mankind alone. So what happens is every foothold we gain as humans, it's in terms of like the quest to live longer, better, richer lives. Each of those small footholds has been achieved in the face of the gods and the nature they created, right? It is humanity on its own that has made these steps forward and overcome the obstacles the gods have thrown in front of them, and we've made that gain. So now, I don't want to say that in those cultures you don't see humanity worship the gods, because you did. They had a form of worship. But if you look closely at that worship, it was almost in a way like asking the gods to not make humanity struggle for advancement more difficult, right? It wasn't like a seeking blessings. It was more of a worship meant to placate and appease the gods enough to keep them neutral, and maybe there was a compassionate God here or there that would help man, but it was not about seeking blessings and loving the gods. It was not that kind of a thing, except for the occasional one where they saw, this idea of, oh, well, that God has helped us, but the rest of the gods, it was still adversarial. There was just, the occasional one that might break from the ranks and help man. But this perspective, if we look at it as a whole, you could see it as disheartening, right? Being this little creature stuck in the adversarial world created by the adversarial gods. However, when it comes to ego, it's incredibly satisfying, right? Because if one looks at the advancement and achievements of humanity as a product of human will alone, how are you not going to grow prideful in that? How does that not satisfy your ego to sit here and say, hey, look, we've done this. The gods were against us. Their nature was against us, but we've done this anyways. It's going to build an ego, right? It's gonna boost them up in a way. And by the way, if you look at the circumstances that ancient man found himself in and ancient humanity existed in, this perspective makes a lot of sense, right? Ancient humanity was in a place where every morsel of food, of drink, a drink of water, finding a bit of warmth in winter, all of these things were won through a hard-fought battle with the elements, right? Everywhere ancient humanity looks, they see at least an obstacle and quite possibly a threat. And so in that world of all those considerations, developing this idea makes a lot of sense, right? It's kind of like, well, of course, that's the perspective they came up with, right? They saw adversary around him and determined that the gods themselves must be adversarial. So it's into that strange turmoil that the biblical perspective on this provides an incredible contrast, right? And one that I don't think we understand quite so much today, because we don't live in the same the same world of strife and turmoil and having to strive to achieve everything. So if we look at Genesis 1, though, we see mankind is presented as the culmination of creation. It's not this addition at the end when creation was found wanting for something. That's not at all what it was. No, all of creation was building towards this thing at the very end. And that's very different. So for biblical man, nature is not an adversary, but it is an untamed tool which can work to humanity's benefit, right? It's kind of like a wild horse, which when tamed can provide tremendous benefit to man. So you're not looking at nature and seeing, oh, that thing is a threat. It's, no, that is a thing that I could use to benefit me, and it'll actually work to my benefit if I bring it into some sense of order, tame it, right? And likewise, and this I think is an important element, nature benefits from man doing this taming as well, right? The wild horse benefits from the relationship of being tamed. Oh, the wild horse, after being tamed, is well fed. It's protected from the elements. It faces actually less threat than it did prior to that, right? We build it a stable to take care of it. And that is part of that is the relationship that humanity and nature would be working towards, is this one of cooperation where you're taming these things. They're not an obstacle to overcome. They're more of a thing that you haven't yet tamed. And this is what is really meant by subduing the earth. This is what the Bible gets to. So the Bible recognizes God as having created a cooperative relationship between man and nature. And that in a way represents the cooperative nature between man and God, right? And that is what he seeks. Of course, this doesn't mean nature just conforms to that cooperative state without man's lead. And by the way, I should say this, if there wasn't an obstacle to cooperation of some sort, then it can't rightly be thought of as cooperation. Cooperation it includes this element of opportunities going different directions. So if God wants to show us that he would like us to have a cooperative relationship with him, part of having a cooperative relationship is the potential to have an uncooperative relationship, right? Otherwise, it's just a thing just is what it is. And nature with us, it has the potential to be very uncooperative. In fact, maybe its natural state is one of uncooperativeness. And then we bring it in through the cooperative process. We make it cooperate with us in a way. We subdue it. So in this way, then the obstacles surrounding culture saw as threats, the Bible here, I think, is actually telling us to look at them more as opportunities. Hello, Stoicism, actually. If we might bring up some other philosophies that have a similar idea. But let me wrap this up and then get you, because the last thing I want to point out is that this perspective, really, I think it has a tremendous effect on how man should view their accomplishments, right? Rather than the process of overcoming nature, accomplishments being the product of ego and leading to ego, it is actually our accomplishments as humans. And when nature benefits us and we reach this cooperative state, it's a product of our coming into better alignment with the way things should be. And so it's not ego that should emerge from that, but rather humility. Humility is the process of understanding and accepting the truth and reality of the way things are and allowing yourself to work within that process, within that design, within that order. That's what humility is. And so really, mankind's accomplishment is not a product of our capacity to overcome something and beat down that obstacle and take it away. No, it's our accomplishments come from being humble, and our accomplishments come from not seeing ourselves as gods, but seeing ourselves as the image of God, if you will, and just coming into alignment with that divine order. So before we get to modern humanity, do you have any thoughts on that then?
Yeah, let me digest. That was a lot.
It was. It's
Let's
a
go.
simple point at the end. You have to build to that.
Let's go one. Let's the. I think it's important to point out that it is not obvious that this idea that somehow reality has a bent towards some type of goodwill and towards some type of goodness. That's not an obvious conclusion. I think that's really important to emphasize. I think from looking at the world, that's not an obvious conclusion. I think that's not an obvious conclusion. You said that it's hard for us to understand that in the modern world. I don't think it is that difficult, but we'll get to that. I think people intuitively understand that now too.
I think
it's
right.
not obvious for us to
even about, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's things that demonstrate it.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
But I think that that's the one thing. The other thing that I think I agree that there's a tendency to build ego based on that perspective of the world. I think there's a tendency to build ego for the 1 to 5% who are able to achieve that, who are able to achieve some sort of mastery over things. The one other thing that I think is really crucial is that ego. I understand your point. It's definitely made that can lead to ego, and I understand the logic of that. I think the other side of the coin that needs to be emphasized is the immense uncertainty that comes with that, and the immense weight that comes with bearing that. It's the idea that like the throne is the loneliest place, because you bear a burden that nobody else bears and nobody else understands. And the idea that you are the only one who has made everything that you have made means that you're the only one who can defend whatever it is you've gained.
Oh, right.
It means that you're responsible for that. So there's two elements of that. It's either delusional pride, or it's some form of crippling anxiety and some form of crippling fear about losing what you have gained. Because forces are constantly working against you.
Ego, right? I still tie even the sense that, well, only I can protect this. That's still ego, right? Pride to me is one of the things that emerges from ego. Paranoia might be the other thing that emerges from ego, right?
That's why I think that's why I don't think you're incorrect.
Pride and paranoia.
I don't think you're incorrect in saying that it is ego, but I think it's important to emphasize that it is not purely some sort of, it's not that sunny of an outlook.
No,
there's very few people who can maintain that delusion and not be tortured by it. The majority of people, I think, would be tortured by looking at the world like that, even if they've gained things.
Right. I think what you're describing is one of the reasons the Christian message spread so quickly, actually.
Yeah.
Is because of this idea of discomfort that comes from the perspective of not working, in cooperation with the gods. And I think that's why you see, even like, the Norse people, moving on so quickly, or Rome becoming a quote unquote Christian nation so quickly, at least in name, I think that's one of the reasons the Christian message was so appealing, is because the cooperation is a relief, actually, as much as anything else. So
that's the point. That's where I think these two points are really important to emphasize, is that this was not an obvious thing, which I think is well established. And also this has a tendency to be of immense benefit to humanity. Yes. And there are things like this in life, and I don't have any that are coming immediately to mind as examples, but let me describe it. Is there are certain thought patterns or certain beliefs that are immensely beneficial once they are adopted. However, it's not very easy to have someone adopt them because they're not obvious.
Right.
So the belief that things are working cooperatively towards a good end, and in this context, which I think is true, is that we are working cooperatively with the divine towards a good end, is not immediately obvious, but it is immensely beneficial if believed. And so that, to me, signifies how miraculous this perspective is that it emerged. Right. And it's no surprise that it has such staying power, but it is miraculous that it emerged out of here.
Yeah. All right. So the main point there is that the biblical conception of the relationship of the human and the divine and the ancient surrounding cultures, and actually, if we look across the globe, you'll see something similar in terms of mythologies. They're very different. They're a stark contrast to each other. And while that may be interesting enough as some sort of, anthropological examination of history or something, it's does it have application for today? That is a good question. So I think if we look at modern society, right, we may lack something like the Mesopotamian array of gods upon which these ideas are set. But I think we may find a very, very similar view of humanity's relationship with nature, right? And this comes from our views of everything from climate change to the COVID pandemic, right? We see a perspective where humanity and nature are adversaries, right? It is an adversarial relationship. And it's interesting to point out, I guess, in that spectrum, we see two different ways of thinking about humanity in regards to humanity's place within nature. In regards to climate change, humanity is seen as the outsider, right? Regretfully causing damage to the otherwise pristine nature of things on the earth, and kind of like ancient man, seeing nature as something meant to serve the gods' ends, while humanity only exists to as this outside addition to do the work of extracting things from nature. So there's that disconnected element where we intervene into nature and corrupt it. Both the ancient man and the climate change perspective don't acknowledge the idea of humanity as being something integrated with nature. And then when we look at COVID, we see humanity not considered as something regretful, but we instead see people striving to overcome a threat of nature, right? Seemingly even without consideration of the fight's costs in terms of environmental concerns. No one brings up where all those masks are ending up. That's not discussed, even though clearly that seems to contradict the other one. But what both share in common, though, I think, is we get to ancient man's perspective of feeding the ego, right? In the climate change element, we see an ego that suggests humanity is capable of both destroying the planet and saving it, right? And that is clearly comes from a place of ego. And in the COVID situation, we see an ego that suggests a virus, just an element of nature, can be, prevented, wrangled, maybe even eliminated. We can totally wipe out this virus. We can defeat it. We can overcome it. And so there may be, to some extent, some material truth in those ideas, right? We may be able to have some sort of influence on the climate. We may be able to have some sort of influence on this virus. I don't think in either case we have nearly as much control or influence as we think we do. But let's say there is some material truth to that, just by the way, as ancient man did in a material sense, overcome the various natural challenges that they found over time. Obviously, they overcame various issues. They built shelters. They developed ways of hunting and growing food and all those kind of things, protecting themselves from the dangers of nature. But that still lacks the functional truth of how overcoming those challenges wasn't actually a result of you using your capacity to you having more capacity, I guess, than that other thing, right? That it wasn't a you are greater than this thing. No, those things come about as a result of humbly working within the limitations of humanity and then working in cooperation with nature, right? In other words, the perspective the Bible provides. If we look at this in the ancient man sense, the idea was, look, I recognize that the threats are going to exist out there. And so I'm going to build a shelter that I can cover myself with, that the threats can't get inside.
I think it's important to emphasize in regards to both the climate issue and the COVID issue, but I see this most notably in the climate issue of the especially people who are younger, and I'm talking under 30, the people who've grown up kind of in this environment, no pun intended, but in this environment of climate change, of climate change being the primary enemy, and of humanity being the clear responsible actor, that cause of this, the burden that becomes,
right,
and the psychological burden that becomes to individuals. And this is where I think it was the same that I wanted to emphasize with the ego of somebody who's accomplished all of these things, but bears the loneliness of the throne.
Right.
I think it's the same thing in regards to the climate issue, is that it is presented as it is your problem and you are the one capable of solving it. And I think it's granted to say, like, well, maybe there is some sort of minute influence that you as an individual, or even some minute influence that humanity as a whole could have, but it isn't clear how profound that influence could be, or what it actually could be, and how much of that burden we carry. And the perspective, though, is very much of we are on our own, competing with everything else, as opposed to looking at the world as being somehow intended towards goodwill.
And specifically the solution, right? The solution for the climate change advocate, true believer, the solutions often present themselves in ways where we need to extract our influence from nature.
Yeah.
Right? That's how we solve things. We extract our influence from it. We remove ourselves from it.
Yeah.
That's very different than saying we need to figure out how to work with it. We need to coordinate it. We need to work together with it, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually something we will get even into a little bit more detail in our next episode.
Yeah.
Because I think actually that provides a lead in, actually, the environmental issue, to what we'll discuss next time. But so I'm gonna hold that off there, I guess, in terms of getting in more detail. But yeah, I want to make sure we hammer at least once more that the Bible, once again here, though, is providing a stark contrast to the beliefs of modern man. So I think we might be getting to the idea here, like you were saying, that maybe we can actually see that challenge of nature. We just see it differently than ancient man saw.
Correct. I think, let me present just two brief things related to the modern approach. Then I think the one other, which I hinted at, related to the climate change, but I think it spreads broadly, is when we talk about a mental health crisis in our society. I think we have seen at this point an almost full-scale rejection of the biblical narrative that's been established here, that things are tending to work towards good. And even if I know Christians like to argue, oh, well, there was a time when everything's culturally Christian, but not everybody's actually Christian. And we could argue about that, but it certainly, if a culture is Christian, the outlook on the world does tend to pervade throughout society. And so the outlook that things are tending to work towards good pervaded more through society than I think it does now.
Yeah,
and
there's
so
there's a difference to get to what you're saying. When you are so maybe not everyone on a micro level is Christian in a quote unquote Christian society, but there's this macro level Christian society phenomena. Correct. And that does go to things like that, right? Where there is maybe not everyone is behaving morally, in Christian morality at a micro level, and that's probably very true. But at the macro level, that immorality is still not accepted, right? Even if there are those who are not behaving that way.
Yeah.
And same thing with something like this.
I mean, I've heard countless people say, I've everything's working out for a plan. And I know people will scoff at pithy statements like that, and that has been scoffed at a lot. But at the same time, that is the fact that was on the tips of so many people's tongues for decades. That's significant, and that shows a worldview that's different. And I don't know the last time I heard somebody say that who is not somehow spiritually involved in a church or something like that. Right. So that sentiment is not on the whole. This is the only other thing that I want to mention, because I think it's evidence to the yearning for this worldview. And this sounds out of left field a little bit, but have you heard of the popular movement or practice of manifestation? Have you ever heard of manifestation? Yes. Okay, you're familiar with manifestation. A brief bit of it is the idea being that somehow that you envisioning your whatever desire you have in life or dreams, whether it be career or whether it be like your love life or anything like that. It's a popular thing amongst people, again, under the age of 30. Envisioning whatever it is you're desiring coming true. And then there's oftentimes some type of mantra or statement that goes along with it, like I am becoming whatever X, or this is happening. It's almost a type of meditation kind of. It's an fairly popular phenomena right now. And I would contend that it is very similar, or it rhymes with this worldview, but it has God removed from it. And there's a spiritual element to it. A lot of people it's not clear what everybody believes related to it, whether it's a psychological parlor trick or whether says some sort of spiritual significance. Is unclear, and I think it's varied how people approach it. But it does indicate that people desire to have this world, it is almost better, or it is almost healthier to have this perspective that the world is having a tendency to work out towards some type of good. Now, you could contend easily that this is an ego relationship. Yes. Let's say that. Yeah, there's a cooperative relationship. And so it's a yearning for that. And I think it's a result of this full-scale abandonment of this perspective of God created the earth and all of these things were good. And there is meant to be cooperation. And that's, I should point out, when you say, and you've said it a few times, that things are tending towards the good. I want to clarify what you mean by that, because I still go back to Genesis 1 at the very beginning of it here, where all is void and in chaos, right? And so to me, I actually would say, well, it has a tendency actually to slip back into that chaos, but to tend towards the good in the sense that you're saying it. I think you are saying the idea of, if we work cooperatively, it will be good, right? That there is a way in which we can work towards nature cooperatively, and that thing will work towards good. But I don't, because I would say, I think that's true. And if we work uncooperatively, if we work in an adversarial way, then I think it would work out towards the not good, right? It will move us towards that chaos, that formlessness and void. But if we are working cooperatively, it will tend towards the good. In other words, there is I guess my point is not so much that things are tending towards the good, which is what you've said a couple of times. I want to just see if we can examine that. I'm trying to think through that. Because my thought would be more that it is possible to tend towards the good. Like, that is an achievable thing, right? In absence of us not working cooperatively with nature, then I think things don't tend towards the good if we are not trying to foster that cooperative relationship.
If we don't,
Yes,
then
I
there
would
will be
agree.
weeds.
I
And we're
would
going
agree.
ahead to Adam and Eve here a little bit, but
I
that
think the
is where the idea of
fundamental
there being
idea,
weeds.
I think the fundamental idea is there is a main actor who has your back in going in that direction. I
Yeah,
think
things.
that's
Yes,
I
I've
so I think
seen
you're
things
right
as
in saying that
fundamentally
as I
designed in a way that they can be increasingly good.
yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, agreed. Agreed.
Okay.
I think that I think the idea that human action can somehow achieve good, whereas I see the and that it isn't all dependent on just you doing it. That
Yes.
as you're
Yeah.
working, somehow there are workings within the cosmos that are pushing in that direction too.
Right. Right.
Which is the idea I think behind manifesting is that things is that if I set my sights on going in that direction properly, then somehow there's other forces in the ether that will compel that forward as well.
Yeah, I think the
but if I don't
manifestation
do that,
thing,
it's not like they're going on without me. I think that's the idea, and that's where you're saying cooperatively.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's if I get aligned with that direction of things going towards the good, that I will be going along with that too. Yeah.
It's
and somehow something else cooperating with you relieves that sense of that we talked about earlier, that sense of ego being both an opportunity for pride, but also an opportunity. Well, pride is also a part of this, an opportunity for fulfilling oneself, but also an opportunity for torture because it's such a precarious position. The feeling of if I'm going in the right direction, there is something else going with me is I think what I'm getting at when I'm saying tending towards good.
Yeah, to me, it's the acknowledgement of an inherent order, and that order is good.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. I understand what you mean by the tendency towards chaos, that things not maintained tend towards chaos. I think
if we are neutral, things actually tend towards slipping into chaos because we are that capstone of creation, right? We are the image of God. We are the thing that is meant to subdue the earth. We are meant to propel this ordering process forward, right? But we must do that then. We must be cooperative with it and bring ourselves along in alignment with that. And as we bring ourselves into alignment, everything else will continue within that alignment as well.
Yeah. In a way, it's still a heck of a responsibility, but it is alleviated of the torture. Yeah. It's not lonely in that you have something else that is, you are a part of something. You're not the sole warrior defending your kingdom. Yeah.
Right. Which to look again at the modern world a little bit closer, where I'm suggesting they have a perspective that's very similar to the ancient man, I think we see those issues, right? We see a craving to be a part of something, and we see unbearable senses of loneliness that people feel.
Which is why today, I think the depression and anxiety, that's why that's so high.
Right.
It is this feeling of like, it's like Dawkins got what he wanted. Everybody does think that that it's all going nowhere and it doesn't matter anyways. And everybody's looking around and saying, well, this stinks.
Right.
It's like, you don't understand. That was a brilliant idea. And I think it's reality and to be combating that and trying to convince people out of it is.
And I mean, we don't want to get too heavily into current events, but I will just say that the response to COVID or the desired response to climate change, some of the things we've seen there, and the we're all in this together attitude is born out of that, what we're lacking in the modern perspective on things.
Yeah.
Right.
It certainly does have a religious
we need to be working together towards something. Now, the right thing to push that instinct towards is towards God's inherent order. But in absence of that belief, that sense of perspective, it gets put into issues of the moment, threats of the moment, right? And so that is why there's such a strong desire for everyone to be on board with the exact thing that we're doing, because otherwise it feels lonely.
Yeah.
So, all right, with that, we're going to look at one more last takeaway from this. We're gonna expand a little bit further on that idea of kind of relationship with nature. Climate issues relate to that, but really it'll be more specifically about what burden do we now bear as humanity, having recognized the situation based on Genesis 1. So we'll do that next time. Be sure to like, subscribe, check us out, comment, email unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you then. Thanks.